afternoon. Welcome to the City Club Forum. I am Nelson Weiss, President of the City Club of Cleveland. Today our forum speaker is Mr. Thomas M. Devine of Washington, D.C. Mr. Devine is an attorney and since 1980 has been the legal director for the Government Accountability Project, GAP, a nonprofit public interest group that attempts to protect whistleblowers who raise issues about government mistakes. Mr. Devine describes whistleblowers as those employees of companies who challenge illegality, threats to public safety, and other misconduct, particularly in the nuclear industry. Essentially, Mr. Devine explains the project is intended to protect freedom of speech and to demonstrate that legitimate dissent, either by individual whistleblowers or by civic organizations, can be effective. In November of 1981, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, imposed a $200,000 fine on the Cincinnati Gas and Electric Company for what was reported to be harassment and intimidation of quality control workers, for falsifying documents, and for failing to maintain a proper quality control program. Cincinnati Gas and Electric Company is one of 3 utilities building the Zimmer nuclear power station near Cincinnati. This fine was the largest in Nuclear Regulatory Commission construction history and resulted from the watchdog efforts of Mr. Devine and his Government Accountability Project. Mr. Devine is a native of Chicago and a graduate of Georgetown University, Phi Beta Kappa major in government. Following his graduation from Antioch Law School in Washington, he served as law clerk to Chief Judge Theodore Newman of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. During this latter period, he co-authored a book titled Blueprint for Civil Service Reform, which analyzed patronage scandals during the Nixon administration. In his present position, Mr. Devine has used whistleblowers to scrutinize problems at various nuclear power stations and has forced the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to pay significant attention to problems that nuclear industry workers have reported. Mr. Devine speaks to us today on the subject, Who Decides How Safe is Safe? Making the Nuclear Regulatory Project Accountable to the Public. Mr. Devine.
When I received the invitation to speak at the City Club, I was particularly pleased to learn that I was speaking at a citadel of free speech, because freedom of speech is the reason to be at the organization where I work, the Government Accountability Project of the Institute for Policy Studies. We help whistleblowers, those employees who challenge illegality or misconduct within government agencies where they work, or over the last few years at nuclear power plants that they're helping to build when they think that public health and safety is threatened. And part of the reason for our work with whistleblowers is that we believe in Jefferson's warning that the price of liberty and freedom is eternal vigilance. And we work with whistleblowers to be vigilant in making sure that our government does the job that it promises to do for us. And we've learned that at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that vigilance is particularly appropriate because they're not doing the job that they've promised to do. They're not doing the job that they've told us they are. And I think this is of local interest where you have a nuclear power plant under construction here, the Perry plant, whose cost estimates have risen from $800 million originally to over $5 billion now. And it's particularly appropriate when the utility which is building the Perry nuclear power plant reacts angrily to citizen allegations by stating that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission already decided that that wasn't a safety problem. Today I'd like to go over with you the reasons why we can't take the NRC's reassurances at face value. And I'd like to do this by looking at 4 traits of the NRC's work over the last few years. Traits that are relevant to their approach to whistleblowers, to utilities, to the personnel who work for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and to the public, ourselves. You'll see drastically different approaches That's what I've learned over the last few years. Let's start with the way the Nuclear Regulatory Commission deals with whistleblowers, those employees who try to work within the governmental system to see that abuses are corrected at the power plants they're helping to construct. I would like to discuss 6 traits with you of how the NRC has dealt with whistleblowers. All of these examples that I'll be discussing are based on my own personal experience with nuclear employees who have become disillusioned and very embittered at their experiences with the NRC. The first trait is that sometimes the NRC will refuse to talk to the employees or to investigate specific issues that they raise. Now, they'll let you walk into the office and get something off your chest, but when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, to really rolling up your sleeves and going to work on these problems, the NRC oftentimes isn't interested. One example where this occurred was at the LaSalle nuclear power plant outside of Chicago, Illinois, and in particular a contractor for a nuclear utility there, the ZAC Corporation, working on the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system. An employee who was in charge of a cleanup program within ZAC to upgrade their quality assurance program was repeatedly frustrated when his management wouldn't allow him to do his job. So he went to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and brought them stacks of evidence that records on quality assurance were being falsified deliberately to show that nuclear-grade materials had been bought when actually the ZAP Corporation had only purchased commercial-grade materials that didn't have the safety reassurances. Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission put his information in a file in Chicago and told him that they would get back to him. They didn't. So Mr. Howard came in another half dozen times to try and talk with them. Each time they met him in the lobby and said they would get back to him. Finally, Mr. Howard became frustrated and came to the Government Accountability Project. Together with local media, we forced the NRC to investigate. They weren't going to until they were exposed for sitting on this evidence. A second example of this occurred very recently at 3 Mile Island. It's significant to note that retaliation against employees who try to raise safety concerns within a utility or contractor's organization is illegal under the Atomic Energy Act. You can lose your license for retaliating against those who disclose violations of the Atomic Energy Act. When the senior operating engineer at 3 Mile Island tried to do this, however, within his organization, he had his duties stripped away. And he went to the NRC and asked them to look into the problem. They told him they weren't interested in investigating retaliation. Well, that backfired because the senior operating engineer, Mr. Rick Parks, then came to the Government Accountability Project. And the next thing you know, his allegations were on the front pages of the New York Times. It pays for the NRC to do its job, but I'm afraid they're not always very far-sighted in that respect. The second trait that I've seen with the NRC and whistleblowers is that they violate their confidentiality. Oftentimes, employees want to work with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but they don't want to have their identities revealed because it could hurt their working relationships back on the job. They want to do their duty, but they don't want to do it with fanfare. Unfortunately, the NRC doesn't always give them that choice. Under the law, the NRC is required to protect confidentiality, but I have seen example after example where they didn't honor those commitments. One case occurred at Zimmer last year, or actually it was in 1981, when the number 2 man in the Quality Control Department spoke freely with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was a key witness in the $200,000 fine that eventually was levied there. Unfortunately, the day after he spoke in confidence to the NRC, the management of the corporation pointed him out as the cause of all of their problems with the NRC. His cover had been blown, and he was shifted to a paperwork shuffling job and had his responsibilities drastically reduced. A second example occurred at the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant down in Texas. At Comanche Peak, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission refused to share with local interveners documents which identified a key witness on safety problems at the plant. We were somewhat frustrated, however, to learn that they had already shared the identity of this witness with the utility management at the nuclear power plant. Eventually, they had to share it with everyone, but their obligation was to protect him from being revealed to those who would retaliate against him. It was interesting also that the NRC refused to investigate the retaliation charges there. He eventually was vindicated under Department of Labor proceedings, but that cast real doubt on the efficacy of the NRC's program to protect whistleblowers. A third example, again, concerns Mr. Parks at 3 Mile Island. He had gone in and required confidentiality before he spoke with the NRC representative. Unfortunately, he found out from his friends that when the NRC investigators started to pursue some of the engineering concerns that he raised, they would ask them if they had the same problems with the plant that Rick Parks did. That was another reason why Mr. Parks decided to go public. He figured that everybody that he was worried about knowing his activities already knew them. The NRC had told them. He might as well tell the rest of the world. The third trait that we have seen with respect to NRC investigations is that they shrink the scope of the issues that are raised by employees at the nuclear plants until they are defined so narrowly, so technically, and so specifically that it's impossible to find the full extent of problems raised by the employees or to uncover the root causes of the violations. The most that you can hope for from NRC investigations as a routine is that the specific effects will be uncovered, and that means that the problems can recur over and over again. Well, let me give you a few examples of this. The most dramatic example involved the Zimmer nuclear power plant with Mr. Tom Applegate. Mr. Applegate brought serious charges to the NRC there about a quality assurance breakdown. By the time the NRC was finished defining the issues, it was down to an investigation which found that he was right and one paperwork violation had occurred. The NRC refused to look at the full scope of concerns that Mr. Applegate raised, and they refused to speak to the witnesses that Mr. Applegate suggested. So GAP started conducting our own investigation. We spoke to those witnesses. We didn't define out any of the issues that he raised. And the result was a $200,000 fine in 1981 and the suspension of all safety-related construction in 1982. Something was seriously wrong with the NRC approach. The fifth trait that we've seen is oftentimes the NRC will try to get witnesses to change their statements. They'll return the affidavits to the witnesses later to delete the portions that the agency's management can't live with. For example, at Zimmer, witnesses had their affidavits returned to them to have their references to responsibility by CG&E management for the quality assurance breakdown and hardware effects of the breakdown deleted. Sometimes the affidavits were deleted entirely from the reports, and this allowed the NRC at the Zimmer nuclear plant to say that the real problem there was with the contractor, the Kaiser Corporation, and that it hadn't resulted in more than a paperwork problem with respect to quality assurance at the plant. It was unfortunate that they deleted from the report entirely an affidavit which detailed the history of CG&E's top management firing the Kaiser executives who tried to defend the quality assurance program at the plant. That was a very significant deletion. It meant that the record that was supplied by the witnesses wasn't the record that the government supplied to the public. The final trait that I've noticed with respect to whistleblower allegations is that the NRC just doesn't get to them until it's so late that they're moot. For example, at the Zimmer nuclear power plant, we had 100 allegations pending in November 1981 when the NRC issued its report. Over the last year and a half, rather than catch up on those allegations that are pending, they now have 300 allegations that are pending. Meanwhile, the employees have been largely laid off because of the suspension of safety-related construction, and the issues are becoming very stale. We don't know if we'll be able to get to the bottom of them or not at this point. Now, that's the NRC's approach to whistleblowers. How about their approach to the utilities themselves? I think there's a major contrast there. Allow me, please, to discuss with you 5 traits of their approach with utilities. One example is a common practice of having closed-door meetings to decide regulatory policy. For example, at the Zimmer nuclear power plant, when CG&E wanted to nominate the Bechtel Corporation to be both the manager of the plant and the independent judge of the quality of work done, this was going to be a very sticky assignment to try and convince the NRC officially that they could be objective when they were managing the project. Well, the NRC had a closed-door meeting with CG&E, and I wanted to attend that meeting. I called up and asked if I could. And the NRC officials from Chicago said, no, you can't attend because our regional administrator wants to talk tough to the utility about what's going wrong at this plant, and we think that he should be able to do it in private. So I said, that sounds reasonable. Until I got a copy of the minutes of the meeting, and I found out that what was actually going on was the NRC regional administrator was coaching the utility on how to get their nomination of Bechtel approved before they made it. It would be very difficult in light of their problems at the Midland nuclear power plant and the fact that they're going to be managing the project. So they gave him some hints on how they could write it up and obtain approval of it. Fortunately, we found out about the meeting and a number of other serious problems, and eventually the NRC was forced to reject the nomination. A second example of this is to give advance warnings to the utilities of when the NRC is going to be conducting investigations. We saw this at Zimmer in the investigation of Mr. Applegate's charges. Mr. Applegate was a pretty persistent fellow, and after the NRC left the first time, he brought more evidence back to them so that they would have to return to Zimmer. Unfortunately, the NRC investigator called up the utility management and told them when he would be arriving and what he would be looking at. That gave them plenty of time to be ready for him so that there wouldn't be anything when he finally got there. A third example of this is advance warnings on where to look. And I think that I've just pointed that out with that particular example. In fact, in the very report that fined CG&E $200,000, there was a section in it that I found quite curious. The report, as you all may remember, had said there weren't any significant hardware violations at the plant. And the report included summaries of inspections that had occurred. One of the phrases about the inspections that didn't find any hardware violations said, with the assistance of the licensee, NRC inspectors identified relevant hangars. So I asked one of the NRC inspectors, what does that mean, with the assistance of the licensee? I said, well, what do you think it means? They told us where to look. It's not surprising that with that sort of a background, the NRC isn't going to find anything. But it's also not surprising that problems remain hidden. There's not a very strong incentive for utilities to build a plant soundly if they get to pick what sections of the plant will be inspected. Another trait that I've seen with respect to NRC investigations is that they rely on the industry's technical judgment. There's very little use of independent engineering technical judgment at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I hasten to add, that's not because they don't have good people on it. It's because a muzzle is put on their technical people. For example, at the LaSalle nuclear power plant, the vendors, the architect engineer there, Sargent and Lundy, supplied calculations which said that there wasn't any safety concerns whatsoever to have drilled more than 1,000 holes in the reinforcement bars of the concrete that was holding up the reactor vessel. We thought that was, on its face, a little bit suspicious. So we asked the NRC about it, and they said that they wouldn't be second-guessing the engineering judgment of Sargent and Lundy. We thought that was a little bit suspicious since they were investigating Sargent and Lundy at the time they were accepting their word at face value for engineering defaults and defects at the Zimmer nuclear power plant, which they were also the architects at. Out in San Onofre nuclear plant in California, a whistleblower there pointed out that the welding violated the American Welding Society standards. It didn't meet the codes for quality. Well, the NRC's response to this was to ask the utility, Southern California Edison, and the contractor, the Bechtel Corporation, for what their version of proper welding standards was. Well, eventually the allegations were rejected, and we, under the Freedom of Information Act, found out on what basis. They were rejected on the basis of the reports that Bechtel and Southern California Edison had sent to the NRC. Although the NRC's public disclosure stated that they had done an independent evaluation of those reports, we didn't get an independent evaluation under the Freedom of Information Act. We merely got a cover page that said that the reports had been received from the utility and were acceptable. They're relying on the industry's expertise, not on their own independent expertise. Another problem that we've seen is advanced copies of NRC decisions. As a matter of fact, this was a specific policy for several years in one of the NRC regions. It was a public scandal recently at the Environmental Protection Agency, but it's been a way of life for years at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to send drafts of their reports to the utilities for their comments before the NRC releases them to the public. I was particularly concerned to see something similar to this at 3 Mile Island in an investigation that we're conducting currently there, where the NRC had issued a public letter saying that a particular program for repairing and testing the polar crane, which is going to lift the reactor vessel out of the ground, out of the floor at 3 Mile Island for part of the cleanup program, and is a key part of the recovery program. That there weren't any problems with the polar crane program. Then we found a few days later a note from the NRC to the utility that listed serious problems with the polar crane retesting and repair program. It was a flat contradiction of what they had put in the public documents room. And our understanding from the whistleblowers that we have worked with there is that this note will then be reviewed by the utility. They'll meet with the NRC, decide on some sort of consensus for what both sides can live with, and then they'll have something that they'll release to the public documents room, which amends their earlier position on this. Now, it works in the other direction, too. At 3 Mile Island, another phenomenon that we have seen is that when the utility puts together programs and submits them to their quality assurance and engineering experts for review and approval, rather than wait for that cycle to finish, they give them to the NRC at the same time. They send the draft procedures to the NRC at the same time those procedures are being developed by the internal organizations there. And the NRC gives the utility executives the okay on those draft procedures. Well, what's the effect of this? When the folks in the Quality Assurance Department or the Site Operations Department are doing their engineering reviews and they find that there are serious program flaws in those procedures, they're told, well, the NRC has already approved this and they're just waiting to sign off until you do. As one whistleblower told me, this puts us in a very defensive position. The NRC is undercutting our work here at the plant. We're told that we're responsible for delaying the project because the NRC is just waiting on us. I don't think that's a real example of public service. In my opinion, that is an example of public disservice. Well, let's look at the NRC's approach to its own personnel then. I can tell you about 4 traits that I've learned of with respect to the NRC's own personnel. And I want to emphasize that there are many very dedicated inspectors, engineers, and investigators at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'm proud to be associated with some of the men that I've worked with there. However, the NRC management doesn't always back up the inspectors on their work. Let me give you a few examples of this. One case is censorship of the reports. For example, at Zimmer, the NRC's internal watchdogs did a report which criticized the initial response to the Applegate allegations. Well, that was fine, and we thought the system was working, until under the Freedom of Information Act, we found out all of the things that they had censored from that report. For example, they had censored an interview which was 20% of the original report, which said that the NRC's regional administrator had known that plant was out of control since before 3 Mile Island, and they sat on the information for 3 years until Mr. Applegate and Gap forced them to do their job. They censored another section of the report, which pointed out that the NRC inspector at Zimmer was violating the standards that he taught in classes to the rookie inspectors out in Chicago. That allowed the NRC in Chicago to put up a pretty strong rebuttal to the report when it finally was released by the NRC's watchdogs. They couldn't have defended themselves out of Chicago, however, if the whole report had been released. A second example of this is leadership from the national office undercutting the local people. In the spring of 1981, the NRC inspectors who had gone out and looked at Zimmer wanted to suspend safety-related construction at the plant, because the allegations were simply getting out of hand. There was so much they couldn't keep up with it, and they were finding serious hardware defects. Well, Mr. Victor Stello, one of the top bureaucrats in the agency, came out to Chicago and told them they weren't going to be able to do this, that as far as he was concerned, it was a paperwork problem. There was no need to shut down operations at Zimmer. It would be better to put the utility in charge of its own reinspection program, which is just what they did. And the party line at the agency then became, it's only a paperwork problem. The utility has been ignorant, and we'll put them in charge. That was the party line until, once again, whistleblowers and outside groups such as ours forced the truth to come out. A third example of their handling and undercutting of their own investigators within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission concerns criminal investigations. It's maybe a little bit surprising that in the history of the Atomic Energy Act, we've only had a handful of indictments for criminal violations and no convictions for criminal violations of the Atomic Energy Act. And it's surprising because we keep hearing on the news all the time about the falsification of records there. And that's criminal when you falsify records deliberately. Well, there's a good reason why they haven't had criminal prosecutions. The NRC won't unleash its own watchdogs. We saw a very good example of that at Zimmer, where the NRC's criminal investigators were closing in on violations by some of the top management of the company in August of 1981. At that point, the NRC's top brass got together and decided that there wouldn't be any further criminal investigation because that was interfering with the civil safety investigation. It was spooking the witnesses, and we were more concerned about the public health and safety than putting anyone in jail, so we would put the criminal investigation on hold, the NRC explained. That lost a little bit of credibility when the safety investigation was also put on hold for 5 months and the criminal investigation didn't start up again. Once again, it took a public scandal to start the wheels of government moving again. It was very depressing for me. And finally, with respect to the NRC's own handling of personnel, they suffer from one of the worst diseases in the merit system for all federal agencies. It's what they've called in a Merit Systems Protection Board study the buddy system for personnel appointments and promotions. It means that you either go along and get promoted, you become a whistleblower, and get fired, or you quit in disgust and go on to another agency. The employees that I've worked with at the NRC have told me there's a lifespan of about 2 years for the go-getters. After that point, they either have to resign themselves to their disillusionment and just start going along with the system, or they look for a job at another agency, or they contact the Government Accountability Project and we start working together. Finally, I'd like to look at the NRC's traits in dealing with the outside world, with us, the public, that they're supposed to be serving. There's a few traits that I want to summarize for you briefly. The first one is what happens when you ask for NRC records under the Freedom of Information Act. There is now a policy that has become quite routine at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of destroying the drafts to their reports. Well, it's no wonder. At the Zimmer nuclear power plant, we found so many drafts of reports which had been drastically diluted before they got to the final version, that the head of the NRC's own internal watchdog unit ordered his people to destroy their drafts after there was a Freedom of Information Act request from the Government Accountability Project. And when they balked at doing that, he said, well, if you won't destroy them, take them home. But I don't want to give these out under the Freedom of Information Act. That is a very poor policy. It eliminates the possibility of government accountability because you don't know what's been changed over the course of an investigation. Well, there's another trait that the NRC has had. That is to harshly criticize the citizens groups that blow the whistle on the agency. For example, the organization that I work for, the Government Accountability Project, has been red-baited intensively over the last year. Witnesses are warned to stay away from the Government Accountability Project, otherwise their information will be known all over Russia, the witnesses are told. Of course, freedom of speech has very little to do with authoritarian or dictatorship types of governments, and we think that those are abhorrent. Unfortunately, we have to deal with a type of red baiting that we hoped had gone out in the 1950s. The NRC retaliates just as viciously against the public as they do against their own employees. And finally, something that we're going to be seeing here in Cleveland in a few months when the licensing hearings open. When there are licensing hearings at nuclear power plants, the facade of NRC objectivity disintegrates. And any of you who choose to come out to the hearings are going to see the NRC lawyers and the utility lawyers working in an open partnership at these hearings. I would demand, if I were in your place, that the NRC maintain its objective, independent role at licensing hearings as well as investigations. They're there to serve us, not the utilities. What is the lessons that we've learned from the last few years with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Well, one lesson that I've learned is that the NRC is undercutting the quality assurance organizations at the nuclear power plants themselves. That the best friends of the public are probably the quality assurance personnel who work for the utilities rather than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspectors. A second lesson that I've learned is that the NRC is giving the public a false sense of reassurance, a false sense of security with the NRC reassurances that there's nothing the matter at these nuclear power plants. A third lesson that I've learned is that it may be time to start considering alternatives to the NRC. We may be a lot safer if we abolish the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and made utilities financially liable for their own negligence. Right now, once a utility gets the NRC's stamp of approval, or rubber stamp of approval, they're off the hook financially if there's an accident. The public will pay. I have the feeling that utilities and contractors would be a lot more careful if they had to answer to insurance companies rather than to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Overall, I think that the lesson we're learning is that eternal vigilance is necessary in the area of nuclear power and other dangerous technologies. We can't trust the government to take care of us. If we do trust the government to take care of us, and if we accept the NRC's reassurances at face value, well, then we're going to lose the freedom to be safe in our own homes. Eternal vigilance is necessary for the freedom to live in a community without fear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Devine. Today at the City Club Forum, we're listening to Thomas M. Devine of the Washington-based Government Accountability Project, speaking on nuclear plant safety. In just a moment, we'll turn to our question period, but first, some announcements. Many of you in our audience, both here and on our broadcast networks, are regular supporters of our Forum Foundation. We've spoken many times about our foundation. It's a key part of our program here and so meaningful to all of us. Your tax-deductible donations help us maintain the high level of weekly presentations that we're able to make at our Forum programs. We appreciate your interest and support very much. We invite others of you also to lend your support. Send your gift, if you will, to the Forum Foundation, 850 Euclid Avenue, Cleveland 44114. You'll be helping the cause of free speech here in Cleveland. Each donation will be promptly and gratefully acknowledged. Today, we do not have students with us because of the spring break in the schools. They'll be back with us next Friday. Next week, our speaker will be Charles DeBona of Washington, president of the American Petroleum Institute. His subject will be Energy, the Lessons Learned. Be sure to make your reservations early for this very important address. Now for our questions for Mr. Devine, we have two microphones, one in the front with Alan Davis, one in the rear with Bob Cavano. Raise your hand to be recognized. We'll start with our first question. John?
Have you any evidence, Mr. Devine, that money is being passed to cover all these terrible disclosures? And the second question is, because the spent plutonium is so dangerous, how is progress being made in discovering something else other than nuclear power for electricity? Thank you.
Ma'am, in response to your first question, we have not seen evidence of corruption such as bribery at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I've been working on these cases for a few years, and I just haven't found any evidence of that. To me, the explanation is more that this is a tradition and a way of life at the NRC. The NRC evolved from the old Atomic Energy Commission, and the top leaders in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission went to work at the AEC. That's where they got their starts. And at the AEC, they were basically nuclear salesmen. They sold these nuclear power plants to utilities and said, don't worry too much about the red tape. We'll make sure that's not there. And we'll be around to help you service your power plant. We'll be advisors to you if you have any problems. In 1974, they changed the nature of the atomic oversight with the Energy Reorganization Act. And now we have the Department of Energy trying to sell nuclear power, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to make sure that it's safe, and basically to be like policemen. Unfortunately, you can't just change somebody's initials and their title and expect them to change their attitudes. They've been partners with the utilities for years, and they still consider themselves that way. I think it's understandable, and it's not necessarily in bad faith. I think many of the NRC executives deeply believe in nuclear power, and they're trying to help get our country's energy together. Unfortunately, they're just as short-sighted as the utility executives who think that it's acceptable to take shortcuts and gambles now because most likely nothing will go wrong. Something can go wrong. They have no business gambling with us, even if they are dealing with their friends. The second question that you have is on alternatives. Unfortunately, under the Reagan administration, the budget for alternative energy sources has been drastically cut until solar programs, which are very promising, are now no more than token aspects of the Department of Energy. There's a real need for public input to the federal government to restore the possibility of something other than nuclear power, because that possibility is being cut off currently.
Mr. Devine, have there ever been instances where GAP has investigated a complaint brought against a nuclear plant for safety or materials violations, where GAP has investigated and found that, in fact, the whistleblower who blew the whistle was wrong? And if there have been, I wonder if you could describe an incident or two of those cases.
Well, sure. So there have been a number of cases like this. There was a plant down in Georgia that we received information on, and it just wasn't impressive enough. It was anti-nuclear information. It wasn't specific quality assurance problems. And we wrote back to the people and said we couldn't work on it. At Comanche Peak, we chose not to work on the case initially because the evidence that was sent to us simply didn't disclose violations of the law. It was problems with nuclear power. We since have gotten involved with that case on a minimal level because of the NRC's treatment of whistleblowers there. And the interveners there, I think, learned their lessons and done very thorough research on specific safety problems at Comanche Peak, and they now have an active intervention going. But we didn't help them on it because they didn't prove it to our satisfaction. At the Zimmer nuclear power plant, I would say that of the people that have worked with me, it has not been uncommon at all for me to shrink the number of issues in their whistleblowing disclosure after talking with other witnesses for verification and really pinning them down about it, whether the utility was adequately dealing with corrective action on it. And that's happened in a number of examples at the Zimmer plant. It's important distinction, however, that if a whistleblower is wrong on one or two items out of 7 or 8 that he or she raises, that doesn't mean that we forget about the rest of it. We back them on everything that they can document and show that there's a reasonable case to investigate. And if they're wrong about 2 or 3 things and they're right about 4 or 5, we'll help them on the half dozen where they do have solid support.
Mr. Devine, I have a two-part question. First, is there any legislation pending or proposed that you would support to give more strength to protection of the whistleblowers in your area? And second, are there organizations such as yours which try to protect whistleblowers in private industry, such as those industries which are dumping PCBs into the water and things of that nature?
Sir, with respect to your first question, unfortunately there is not any legislation pending in that direction. That in itself isn't so bad because we've got decent laws on the books to protect whistleblowers at private nuclear facilities, and under the Environmental Protection Act there is protection for private whistleblowers who disclose violations of the pollution laws. There's protection for private whistleblowers who disclose occupational safety violations. It's not really a problem of a vacuum of laws. It's a problem of a vacuum of enforcement. With respect to your second question on that, with regard to things such as the PCB dumping, our own organization has been active in that. In fact, we're working very intensively on the Dow Chemical case up in Midland, Michigan. And it's a real toss-up right now within GAP, which is the greatest threat to the public health in Midland, the nuclear power plant or the chemical factory there. They're both so active. So we work on those issues, and we advise private whistleblowers to get in touch with local citizens groups who can work with them directly and get coaching from national organizations such as our own. There's a number of groups in Washington that help on these types of things, such as the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C., the Government Accountability Project, many of the environmental groups. Unfortunately, there's just a few people on all of our staffs, and it's really necessary that the local communities be the place where folks roll up their sleeves and start developing a partnership with the employees who are concerned about threats to the local communities. I think it's your folks' direct responsibility, and you have a greater capacity to do it than we do from Washington. And as you raised the question on that, I didn't want to say anything about this originally, but during the announcements period, I realized that it wouldn't be inappropriate. The Government Accountability Project and the Institute for Policy Studies, of which we're a part, are also nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations. And we, too, defend freedom of speech and would appreciate your tax-deductible contributions. You can send them to 1901 Q Street in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Devine, a few years ago at an anti-nuke rally at Davis-Besse, the speaker, an MD, a medical doctor whose name now escapes me, opened his speech by saying that the first casualty of the nuclear power industry was truth itself. Do you think he made a pretty fair statement?
Well, it's a casualty for a part of the nuclear power industry. I believe that there has been a lack of good faith by utilities and contractors dealing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and by the NRC dealing with the public. I don't think that you should extend that, however, to the labor force at nuclear power plants. I found at Zimmer, for example, I've worked with close to 40 whistleblowers now. And those were people who believed so strongly in the truth that they were willing to risk their careers. And many of them lost their careers defending the integrity of their industry and their own personal ethics. That's why our group is in business, and we've got more whistleblowers than we can handle from the nuclear industry. And I shouldn't say it's just the labor force who's down on the plant floor. Up at 3 Mile Island, it's some of the top executives in the utility's own organization and the senior engineers there who are working with the Government Accountability Project. I think that the nuclear industry is probably no more or less honest than other industries that deal with dangerous technologies. Unfortunately, we can't afford to have any dishonesty. The threats from dishonesty at nuclear power plants or at chemical corporations can threaten our safety. They don't just mean that we'll be paying more for our utility bills, although we certainly will. They may mean we have to evacuate our families someday. We just can't tolerate any dishonesty in these very sensitive industries.
You answered part of the question I was going to ask. I wanted to know about the background of the organization, and of course you answered the part about the funding. What is the background of the GAP?
Well, our group has been in existence since 1975. The Institute for Policy Studies was in existence since 1963. It was founded, we just had our 20th anniversary. It was founded by Mr. Dick Barnett and Mark Raskin, two of the best and the brightest in the Kennedy administration who resigned before the Vietnam War evolved into its eventual state and started warning against it. GAP was formed in 1975 to help government employees who wanted to challenge illegal activities at their agencies. And most of our cases still do involve government whistleblowers. We have about 80 cases on our docket now, sir, and they cover the gamut. Almost anywhere where the government spends money, there's liable to be some misconduct involved, either wasted spending or abuse of authority or real threats to health and safety. Just to describe some of our cases, we're representing a whistleblower at the United States Department of Agriculture on the issue of inaccurate grading of meat and approval of sick and diseased animals for human consumption that are so ill. Some of them were dying, and they'd have to shoot them up with shots to keep them on their feet and be slaughtered. These were USDA inspected and approved. Another example of cases that we're looking at is at the Federal Aviation Administration, where the agency has been refusing to allow a backup device to avoid mid-air collisions to be certified for some years now, because it threatened the FAA's own R&D program for a backup mid-air collision warning device that quite clearly isn't as effective as the one that they've been suppressing. We've helped whistleblowers at the National Archives who have warned of the destruction of our historic treasures, our national treaties and records. In fact, these whistleblowers warned that some of the records were being treated with a chemical that was a fire hazard. They were ignored. In fact, one of them was sent from a responsible academic job there to lift boxes in the warehouse to get him out of the way. And unfortunately, there was a fire that destroyed 2/3 of the records in a particular warehouse. We work on just a wide variety of cases. The swine flu vaccine, we've helped whistleblowers warning that our computer system to gather data in the event of Russian attack wouldn't work. The WIMEX computer warning system wouldn't work effectively. We helped him to challenge that. We've worked on waste of funds at a variety of agencies. We don't really have any particular ideology. Right now we're helping a former prosecutor who works at the Department of Interior. He's a former U.S. attorney and a very conservative individual, and he believes in law and order. He was very distressed that Secretary Watt didn't believe in law and order when it came to violations of the Mine Safety Acts and wouldn't let him prosecute the cases. As a result, he's a whistleblower now. I'd say probably a majority of our clients are Republicans, and they're on issues which are very much silent majority type of issues that frustrate us as citizens. We help people who are speaking out on something significant and who are right about it. And before we do that, we investigate their charges. The specific point of view that they have doesn't really matter too much. Someday we might find ourselves like the ACLU, or we've got whistleblowers on both sides of a question. Yes, sir.
Mr. Devine, can you tell us about the problem with Babcock and Wilcox equipment at 3 Mile Island, and if we in northern Ohio should be alert to similar problems at Davis-Besse, where Babcock-Wilcox equipment was used?
Sarah, there's a real temptation to start speaking about that, but I'm not an expert at all on that particular topic. I can say, however, that Babcock and Wilcox beat the pants off of General Public Utilities in the trial that was recently settled. And although it was settled, it was greatly to the advantage of B&W there. I think the thing about 3 Mile Island and Davis-Besse that's the most significant for all of us is the lesson that it shows us about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC had come across the same flaw that helped cause the accident at 3 Mile Island. They came across it at Davis-Besse before the TMI accident. They didn't act on it. Shortly after, we had the near disaster up in Harrisburg. That's the real lesson to be learned from Davis-Besse, at least from my research. I wish that I could help you more on the integrity of the B&W components themselves, though.
Mr. Devine, is there any appropriate action that the state of Ohio could take in overseeing or watchdogging the NRC in regard to hearings and so forth?
Yes, ma'am. There's a number of actions they can take. One is that they can set up their own watchdog committee, and there have been proposals for that from the Cincinnati area for a Zimmer Advisory Council of distinguished citizens, labor leaders, environmentalists, business leaders who would ask the hard questions to the NRC and demand answers. Maybe the NRC would be more willing to talk straight with a watchdog group from the governor than folks who call them up from their homes. It's unfortunate, but it may be true. A second action that the state can take is to participate in the licensing process. We've got licensing hearings that we're trying to get reopened at Zimmer, and it would be very difficult for the NRC to deny our motions on this if the state of Ohio says that they want the licensing hearings also. they could turn their lawyers loose to help the citizens groups at a number of the nuclear power plants. For example, we've got licensing hearings coming up at the Perry plant towards the end of May. It's unfortunate that the utility lawyers have the NRC lawyers to be their informal partners at the hearings. Well, maybe in Ohio, the state government could be the informal partners for the citizens groups and give them a little bit of a shot in the arm, even at plants such as Perry, where we don't already have a huge scandal, but we want to find out whether there is something the matter.
Mr. Devine, I appreciate your intensity of concern and the organization that you represent. I'm confused, and maybe you can help my confusion, or to get out of my confusion.
I'd rather.
In the United States, we seem to have such great difficulty in building nuclear power plants, and they are in trouble from the time the planning begins, even after they're in operation. And yet we hear that there are many, many plants throughout Europe, maybe more than in the United States, I don't know, but we never seem to hear of any troubles either in the building or in the operation of European nuclear plants. Why?
Once again, I want to avoid overstepping my expertise. I can give you a few hints on that I've heard from the NRC at the congressional oversight hearings. One is that in Europe they tend to have standardized designs for their various reactors, and it means it's a lot easier to work out all the kinks in one set of engineering problems and solutions. In the United States, each individual nuclear power plant is unique and develops its own set of trouble spots or vulnerable areas. And that's one reason why we've had a bit more trouble in the United States, and that has a lot to do with why it takes so much longer to build them here than it does in other countries. That's one explanation for it. Another explanation, I think, is that we just don't hear as much about the nuclear power plants in other countries. From just reading the newspapers in our country, I didn't realize that there was very strong protest movements against nuclear power plants in other nations, and there have been the equivalent in those nations of things such as the Vietnam War demonstrations in the United States. And I hadn't heard anything about that until I started studying it a little bit further. I suspect that if I researched the technical problems with European nuclear power plants as closely as I have with American nuclear power plants, I'd also realize that they've had their share of hang-ups. Now, you don't really learn very much of the technical problems with American nuclear power plants even from reading the newspapers there. You have to actually get down to the public documents room and start checking out all of the issues that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has uncovered. And then as a rule of thumb, multiply that by 3 or 4 times, and you start to get some scope of the problems at our nuclear power plants. I suspect you'd have to do that in the other countries as well.
Mr. Devine, you suggested a possible solution to the problem with the NRC was abolish it and let in the spirit of free enterprise, let the utilities go out and work on their own. Recognizing government rarely cancels an existing program, much less an existing agency, what realistic alternative solutions do you see, A, being taken in the present administration, or secondly, that might be taken in the foreseeable future to cure the problems that you have been addressing?
I wish that it weren't so unrealistic to think that the present administration would allow the free enterprise system to assert its own checks and balances. That's supposedly what the present administration stands for, deregulation and the integrity of the free enterprise system. I don't understand why they would be hesitant to let it work here. I think that raises some real questions about the integrity of the present administration's stated policies. But to go beyond that, what can we do realistically? I think one thing that could happen is to have an independent inspector general at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a watchdog that doesn't report directly to the commissioners. And that's something that could develop a more effective system of checks and balances there. And it's something which President Reagan has said he deeply believes in. You may recall that at the beginning of his administration, he fired all the inspectors general from the Carter administration and said he wanted junkyard dogs to keep the bureaucracy in check. We could use a pack of junkyard dogs over at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and maybe he'll extend his policy there. A second thing that would be of great assistance that is practical is to start giving intervener funding from the federal government so that the licensing challenges won't be quite so unequal. Right now, the nuclear industry gets literally billions of dollars in subsidies from the federal government, but any private citizens who want to challenge a particular nuclear power plant or the NRC's record at that power plant are entirely on their own. That's something else that would help to improve our system of checks and balances for public participation. The most important answer to your question is not to depend on the government. If we decide that we have to make the laws better so the government will protect us more effectively, we're liable to be very disillusioned in the future. I think the real answer is for us to start working ourselves on these nuclear power plants, for us to have our own oversight of what the government's doing. There's nothing that can be more effective than for the distinguished folks in this room to sign up and participate with the Sierra Club and the Paralegal Defense Fund. Donate your time and your money and help these people do the job. They're working for all of you here in Cleveland, helping to keep the government honest and helping to keep this nuclear power plant safe. That's what we really need. Don't rely on the NRC to protect you. Do it yourselves.
Devine, in light of the NRC's alleged lackadaisical attitude toward these nuclear power plants, some of these NRC inspectors are going to be at these plants when they're operational. And I wonder if you could tell us about what you see as their motivation for their lackadaisical attitude, knowing that some of these NRC people are going to be at those plants, unless perhaps there really isn't that much for them to be concerned about.
Well, sir, I gave one explanation of that, the history of the NRC as salesmen of nuclear power plants. And they view themselves in that role to a great degree at the operating plants. They're there to answer questions and to share their expertise if the utility is having problems. What we have to do is change that attitude so that they're there as a check on the utilities to see if the law is enforced, rather than as a serviceman who's on site in case the customer decides that there's something they need help with. Thank you very much.
Mr. Devine, thank you very much. Our forum is adjourned.